Okay, welcome back. This is the end of the week 11 lecture. Sorry about that. I had to stop the previous video because I got a message telling me that the video was about to cut off because I was at the limit of my storage space on my computer. So that's a pretty good sign that my lecture is running too long. So let me wrap it up quickly here, but I'll finish that point about the tortoises. So again, this idea of translation. So what Melville's narrator is doing, he's taking the tortoises from their strange natural habitat, kind of an unknowable place that most people have not visited, do not know, and he's taking them aboard the ship. And the ship is very knowable. The ship is very familiar. It's full of people. It's full of other sort of signs of Western civilization. So that's kind of what he means by this process of translation. He also claims that he is transfiguring the tortoises. That means to transform something into, something is being transformed into something more beautiful. So he's doing that as well, and he's comparing the tortoises at one point to the Roman Colosseum. So why is he doing that? Again, it's part of this larger project to make these strange, unknowable things knowable, to make them legible and somewhat familiar to readers. So even if readers had not visited the Roman Colosseum, they're at least familiar with it as a concept. They've probably seen a picture. They know what it is. They're somewhat familiar with it. So by comparing the tortoises, which we're not familiar with, again, readers back then would not have been familiar with them. Now we've all seen pictures of big, huge tortoises, but that wouldn't have been the case in the 1850s. So an unfamiliar thing is being compared to a very familiar thing that most readers would have known. So that's part of what the narrator is doing in those early sketches, trying to make this unknowable place, this mysterious, enchanted place, trying to make it legible for readers. And the final part of the tortoises, it's kind of funny, a little bit sad for the tortoises themselves, but we do know that eventually the sailors will eat them. And the narrator tells us that he later, quote, converts the 3 mighty concave shells into 3 fanciful soup tureens. That's just like a soup bowl. So again, that's the final act of translation. He takes the shells of these ancient, mysterious, unknowable animals that most readers had never seen, and he converts them into soup bowls, something that we're all familiar with, we all understand. So that's what the narrator's doing early on in the early sketches, but he kind of stops doing it in the later sketches. But we notice in the third sketch, the Rock Redondo, again, we are literally being shown around. We are climbing to the top of this rock to get the best possible vantage point so we can literally look around and see the geography of this area. So this is the best mode, as the narrator tells us, of gaining a comprehensive view of this entire region. So not only can we learn about geography from the top of the rock, we can also study the natural history. We can look at all the seafowl, as the narrator tells us. So again, we have this motif of knowability, right? The narrator is trying to let the readers know what this place looks like. And we are literally doing that by climbing to the top of the rock. But of course, there's also kind of a figurative meaning that's operative here as well. But notice that the narrator does give us a warning as we are climbing to the top of Rock Redondo. He says, "But ropes now, and let us ascend, yet soft. This is not so easy." So, of course, yes, literally, he's talking about the difficulty of climbing up this rock. But there's also that figurative meaning. Knowing this place, understanding this place comprehensively is not easy. And it might ultimately prove impossible. But he's still trying. In the fourth sketch, we get that chart kind of documenting all of the wildlife that lives on the islands, and you can find a little bit of humor there if you're looking for it. But by the end of the sketches, the legibility, the knowability, all of that stuff is largely gone. So like in the 8th sketch, that whole, the narrator's language has changed, right? The ability to know things has diminished. So when he's talking about the widow, he's often unable to tell us exactly what has happened. Certain events are inexplicable or unexplainable. So instead of the more direct, straightforward language that we got in the early sketches, in the 8th sketch, we're hearing about, nameless misery and unnamed events, the strangest trials of humanity. So things are getting more ambiguous. Things are becoming more shrouded in mystery, and we're not able to know as much. That continues through the final couple of sketches as well. My favorite has always been the 9th sketch, the Hermit Oberlus. It might seem fairly straightforward at first, but I wanted to point out the author's note that comes at the end of the 9th sketch. I just wanted to share this with you guys very briefly. So again, our pagination's different, but this is at the very end of the 9th sketch. You should be able to see this author's note. And I just wanted to read a little bit of it because it's funny, but it also reveals a lot about Melville's narrative strategies. So I'm just going to read like the first half of it. We don't have to read the whole thing. So here's the author's note. They who may be disposed to question the possibility of the character above depicted are referred to the 2nd volume of Porter's Voyage into the Pacific, a real book, where they will recognize many sentences, for expedition's sake, derived verbatim from thence, from that source, and incorporated here. The main difference between the source material and what the author is doing here, the main difference, save a few passing reflections, between the two accounts, being that the present writer has added to Porter's facts accessory ones, picked up in the Pacific from reliable sources, and where facts conflict, has naturally preferred his own authorities to Porter's. So just notice what he's saying here. It's kind of buried beneath the surface, and his language is part of what makes it kind of obscure. But he's saying, look, I used a source for this, right? I'm not just making this up. If you don't believe me, if you don't believe what you've just read, consult Porter. Consult this historical document that I read, a travel narrative. That's where I'm drawing a lot of this information. But then he tells us, well, but in some cases I did add a few things to Porter's account, based on my own experiences, based on, stuff that I saw in the Pacific. And whenever there was a conflict between Porter's account and my account, I, of course, preferred my own authorities. I preferred, in other words, my own version to Porter's version. So what starts out as a claim to authenticity and truthfulness, at first he's like, hey, I'm following Porter's lead here, right? I'm using the source document. But eventually he tells us, I changed some stuff, and whenever there was a conflict, I favored my version to Porter's version. So what he's really telling us is, I did make a lot of this up. And he goes on towards the end of the note to say, I kind of changed the nature of the character, his personality, and I wanted him to better reflect my own sensibilities, basically. So it's kind of fun, it's playful, but it's also kind of a skeleton key to a lot of what Melville does. Much of his fiction is what we would call heavily sourced, which means he does a ton of research. Another thing that makes Moby Dick very overwhelming, because he's read all of this natural history. He's read about the history of the whaling industry. He's read scientific books, about marine life, about whales, about, sailing, about all these different subgenres. He read so widely. He was so well informed. He had such a breadth of knowledge, and he brought so much of that to bear in his fiction. So again, he really does use the sources, but he's also reminding us that he's writing fiction. He is inventive. He is creating, just like he did with Delano. He took the basic events, but he added the commentary about race and slavery. He added the character of Babbo. He made Delano a little bit dumb and gullible, right? He put his own stamp on those events to make it a compelling work of fiction. So this is that kind of metafictional quality that's often associated with postmodernism. The idea that the author is calling attention to the fact that this is a work of fiction. It's not real. It's invented. He's playing with some real stuff, but then he's doing different things with it. So kind of fun, kind of amusing, and very much Melville. But you'll notice by the very end, when we get to that 10th and final sketch, all of that language about enchantment and mysticism, all of that's gone. We end up in a much more sort of concrete place, much less romantic than some of those earlier descriptions that we got, much less magical, mystical, sort of compelling, taking us on a wild journey. At the end, we have death, and we have people. We have the very unexotic remains of people. So in that final sketch, he's talking about a makeshift post office and gravestones. He's talking about a potter's field. And that was a real concept. I don't think we really have it anymore. We don't call it this anymore. But it was a commonly understood concept in the 19th century. Basically just a burial place for, paupers. Well, that's what they would have been called back then. People who didn't have any money or didn't have any friends or relations. So they couldn't have afforded like a real burial or a real headstone. They would have been buried in what was called potter's fields. That's what we end up with. Nothing very magical about this. Instead, the final resting place for sailors who may have died at sea, right? These are the very real, sort of pragmatic, sort of residues of humans. Very sad, very real remains of humans. So notice this progression. We start at the beginning of the sketches largely with physical descriptions. Right? The focus is largely on the islands themselves. That's what the narrator spends most of his time talking about. The islands themselves and the animals that live on those islands in the case of the tortoises. That's what we start with. By the end, we're more interested in people. The widow, the hermit, the people buried out here, the remains of humans. The remains of human activity. That's where we end up with. Maybe that is easier to know, but we've moved away from that earlier language of enchantment and translation and the mysticism of the islands. And again, we're left with people, very knowable people, and the death of people, which is also knowable. But that's part of this transition that we can observe over the course of the sketches. We go from physical stuff in translation to knowing less and less, but ending up with death and the end of people. So we go from physical to personal, and we go from knowability to a lot less knowability, at least up until we hit death. And that might be more legible, but there's still that element of mystery and maybe a lack of resolution, because again, that's what a potter's field is. The place where people go when they are unknown, when they remain mysterious or unclaimed in some way. All right, that's enough. Thanks for sticking around. Enjoy Melville. If you have questions or concerns, let me know. And next week, we'll start on Whitman and Leaves of Grass.